Minneapolis woman calls it emotional hacking. Scammers drained $800,000 from her dad's bank account.
He's a 76-year-old Ukrainian immigrant who sold his home in Washington state and essentially became homeless a week later.
A 76-year-old man who escaped Ukraine to build a new life in America, worked his entire life to save $800,000, sold his home, and was ready to live out his final years in peace. But in just 8 days, every single dollar vanished.
Yeah, I feel bad. Bad. Feel very, very bad.
Drained by scammers who called and texted him relentlessly until he had nothing left. And by the time his daughter found out, he was homeless and living in a Motel 6 with no way to pay his bills. If stories like this make you want to protect the people you love, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel because we break down scams exactly like this one so you can recognize the warning signs before it's too late.
You'll see. And then I pressed him and pressed him and pressed him, and then finally he relented and said, "I won Sweepstakes." And I'm like, oh no.
When his daughter Julia finally got her father to admit what had happened, she said he told her, "I won Sweepstakes." And she immediately knew that her father, a man who had survived so much in his life, had been emotionally manipulated by criminals who knew exactly how to exploit his trust and his hope for a better future. This case reveals something deeply troubling about the way modern scammers operate, because they don't just steal money, they steal dignity. They steal security. Let me walk you through exactly what happened and when, because understanding the timeline is crucial to understanding how quickly these scammers can destroy a life. Oleh Viko, a 76-year-old Ukrainian immigrant, had been living in Washington state in a 2,300-square-foot home that represented everything he had worked for in America. Public reporting doesn't say exactly when he immigrated or what work he did throughout his life, but what we do know is that he had accumulated approximately $800,000 in savings across accounts at Chase and Bank of America, and he had made the decision to sell his home with plans to live off the proceeds for the rest of his life. This is a man who had done everything right by conventional standards. He had saved, he had invested in property, and he had reached the age where he should have been able to relax and enjoy the fruits of decades of labor. His daughter, Julia Elders, lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, almost 1,700 miles away from her father, which meant she wasn't able to check in on him daily or notice the subtle changes in behavior that might have signaled something was wrong.
April 26th to May 3rd. It was 0.
The scammers contacted Oleh Viko and convinced him that he had won a massive sweepstakes prize worth $17 million. But as with all scams of this nature, there was a catch. He would need to pay fees, taxes, or processing costs up front before he could claim his winnings. Now, to anyone who hasn't been subjected to this kind of sustained psychological pressure, it might seem obvious that this is a scam, but that reaction misses the entire point of how these criminals operate. They don't just call once and ask for money. They call every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. They text constantly. They build what feels like a genuine relationship with the victim. They create urgency and excitement, and they slowly normalize the idea of sending money. What makes this emotional hacking, as Julia Elders so accurately described it, is that the scammers tap into fundamental human emotions like hope, trust, and the desire for financial security. The timeline of the actual theft is shocking in its speed. Between April 26th and May 3rd, a span of just 8 days, the scammers convinced Oleh Viko to drain his entire $800,000 balance through a series of cashier's checks, with individual checks reaching amounts as high as $50,000. Think about that for a moment. This man walked into banks, requested cashier's checks for enormous sums, and sent them to addresses across the country. And somehow, no one stopped him. No bank teller pulled him aside to ask if everything was okay. No fraud detection system flagged the unusual pattern of a 76-year-old man suddenly liquidating his entire life savings through cashier's checks sent to strangers. Julia Elders has specifically criticized Chase and Bank of America for failing to recognize these transactions as suspicious and failing to intervene. And while both banks told reporters they needed more time to investigate the situation, the damage was already done. There's a legitimate question here about the responsibility financial institutions have to protect vulnerable customers, especially elderly ones who may be acting under duress or manipulation. The checks were sent to phone numbers and addresses scattered across the country. And the investigative reporter who covered this story, Corin Hoggart, actually tracked down some of the recipients. One of the phone numbers connected to the scheme was linked to a business called Exquisite Party Management in Florida, a party entertainment service registered to someone named Jenich Ajones. And remarkably, that same name appeared on two of the $50,000 cashier's checks that Oleh Viko sent. When the reporter called this number and reached someone, the exchange was brief and telling.
So what did that have to do with it?
Well, like I said, he sent you more than $50,000 in cashier's checks, and I'm trying to figure out why.
The reporter explained that Viko had sent more than $50,000 in cashier's checks and asked why. And the person on the other end said, "Yeah, I feel bad, really bad," before hanging up. Whether this individual was a knowing participant in the scam, an unwitting money mule, or something else entirely isn't clear from public reporting. But hearing even that brief acknowledgement of wrongdoing was emotionally devastating for Julia Elders. She broke down in tears listening to it, overwhelmed by the realization of how deep and how organized this criminal network actually was. She said it was really hard to wrap her head around the types of people involved, what other things they might be doing, and what other crimes might be connected to this stolen money. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of scams like this. The money doesn't just disappear, it flows into criminal networks that may be involved in all kinds of other illegal activities. And every victim who pays becomes an unwitting funder of further crime. The discovery moment came when Oleh Viko's financial collapse became impossible to hide. He had sold his home, the movers arrived, and suddenly he couldn't pay them because there was no money left. That's when he finally called his daughter. And that's when she pressed him until he finally admitted what had happened.
Coming up against this feeling of like how deep this is going, and it's really hard to wrap your head around of the types of people that are involved, what other things that they're doing, what kind of crime is also being committed with this money.
The confession that he thought he had won a sweepstakes must have been heartbreaking for both of them. The father realizing that he had been fooled, and the daughter realizing that she was too late to stop it. By the time Julia understood the scope of the situation, the accounts were at zero, the checks had been cashed, and her father was essentially homeless. He went from a 2,300 square foot home to living out of a Motel 6, surviving on a $1,600 monthly Social Security check that barely covers basic living expenses in most parts of the country. The contrast is devastating to consider. A man who should be enjoying a comfortable retirement instead facing an uncertain future with virtually no resources. The response from law enforcement and the community has been a mix of action and frustration.
I think banks are in the same position as us, where they would like to prevent this before it even happens.
The FBI is investigating the case, and Julia Elders spoke with an agent before her media interview. But she's not optimistic about recovering any of her father's money. The FBI reportedly told her that she would need to be her own little sleuth.
And the onus is on me. The FBI told me you have to be your own little sleuth.
Which speaks to the harsh reality of these cases. There are so many sweepstakes scams, so many victims, and the money moves so quickly through so many hands that actually recovering stolen funds is extremely rare. The criminals know this, the FBI knows this, and that's part of what makes these schemes so devastating. If you found this breakdown helpful, and you want to protect your family from scams like this one, please hit that subscribe button right now and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because every person who understands these tactics is one less potential victim.